The Western Pennsylvania Disability History and Action Consortium presents Voices of Change, uncovering stories of the Western Pennsylvania disability movement. The Voices of Change logo is in the shape of an arrow pointing right. Voices of Change, the media history project of the Western Pennsylvania Disability History and Action Consortium, records firsthand accounts of disability history. This is an interview with Virginia Flavin Perbanek and Carol Flavin Purshouse. They are the sisters of Danny Flavin, who lived for 56 years at Polk State Center, an institution in Venango County. Danny and his family are part of Western Pennsylvania disability history. Interviewer is Guy Caruso. Photo shows Virginia Flavin Perbanek and Carol Flavin Purshouse. Danny Flavin, born in 1946, was one of 7 children in a large Irish-American family in the Pittsburgh area. Danny grew up in a time when very few services were available for children with disabilities. Danny's parents and siblings provided loving care for him in their home. When Danny was 16 years old, his aggressive behavior created concerns for his safety and the safety of others. No support services were available to help the family keep Danny at home. A photo shows Danny as a young boy. His parents made the difficult decision to move him to Polk State Center, a large institution with about 3,000 residents. A photo shows a map of the Polk Center campus. Danny's transition to Polk was hard on the entire family, but was especially difficult for his father, who doted on his son and worked with him tirelessly. Photo shows Danny with his father, Frank. In this interview, Danny's sisters, Virginia and Carol, speak about their strong connection with their brother, the positive care he received at Polk, and their support of state centers for people with significant disabilities. Photo shows Danny as an adult with his father.
Hello, my name is Guy Caruso. I'm with the Institute on Disabilities at Temple University, and I'm a member of the Western Pennsylvania Disability History and Action Consortium. And it's 1:25, and today is December 14th, 2019. And we're here at Studio ME in the East Liberty neighborhood of Pittsburgh. We're here today as part of the multimedia project of the Western Pennsylvania Disability History and Action Consortium, and we want to record firsthand accounts of disability history. And the life of your brother, Daniel Flavin, is told by Virginia Flavin Perbanek and Carol Flavin Purshouse is part of that history. So thank you, Ginny and Carol, for being here today. Daniel Flavin, and I think you refer to him as Danny Boy or Cowboy Danny, was born in 1946 and he resided at Polk Center, formerly called Polk State School and Hospital in Venango County for 56 years, beginning at the age of 16. And Daniel was the 5th of 7 children born to Frank and Margaret Flavin of Shaler Township, Allegheny County. Ginny, can you tell us a bit about your family? Where did you live while growing up? What did your parents do for a living? What was life like for the family?
Well, as you mentioned, we're a family of 7 children, and my father was a parking lot attendant, and my mother was stayed at home and cared for the kids. We lived in Shaler Township in a modest community, and it was pretty standard for that time. There were 3 older daughters, my sister Peggy and Mary Lou, and there was a brother Tommy who died as an infant. And Carol was just about 10 years older than Dan. And then Dan was born, he was a gift. He was the boy my father had always wanted. And I think when he was first born, they didn't really understand that he had any disabilities except that he was very small and premature and a low birth weight. But he was a joy, everybody loved him. I was born 10 years after Danny. And I have another sister who is 3 years younger than me. But I think to speak to the time of when Danny Boy came home and was the family and how that changed the family, Carol can speak to that better.
Right. Well, when Danny came home from the hospital, at first they were told that he wouldn't live beyond 4. He was so small. I forget how many pounds he was. But we brought him home, and there were myself, Danny, and my two older sisters at that time, because they weren't born yet. And he kind of was just a little baby. I was the baby myself, so we were only 11 months apart. So he just kind of laid, and he didn't do much. Then as he got older, he was always very small. But as he got older, my dad would take him for walks, and I would always go along. I would just be sitting there watching, because Danny needed so much care. And so then over the years, my father, he was a boxer also. And so he had a lot of exercise equipment. And he used to bring Danny out of bed at night, put him on the kitchen table, and he would exercise him. He would have a lot of exercise equipment, and just to get his muscles going. And we would all sit on the steps and watch like it was a movie. And we watched as Danny progressed and was able to stand and then walk. He still never talked that well, but it was we were a pretty happy family. And we went everywhere with them, you know. And if anything happened to Danny, we were all in trouble. But we were happy, and everything was fine. And then when Virginia and Kathy were born, Danny was a little older, and then I think things changed a little bit, the dynamics, because Danny was so close to my dad, and he didn't like anyone bothering my father. So I don't know.
I think there was a lot of sibling rivalry that to someone who was a mental age of 3 was the best thing he wanted to do was get rid of his competition. One night, in the middle of the night, he decided that my younger sister, Kathy, one easy way to eliminate her was to take her out of the crib and throw her over the hill, which he did. He did other things that were really, they were amusing, but whenever you're talking about very young kids, you begin to realize that these are life-threatening behaviors. And clearly, when someone's mentally retarded in a mental age of 3, there was no intent behind that, of course. It was just emotions and hormones and anger and frustration and jealousy, and it became really it became threatening to the other kids in the family. And so they didn't have alternatives that you have today, where they could have gotten behavioral interventions or other therapies, and the only option they had at that point in time was to really put Danny into Polk, a residential community, which is a really, really very difficult decision at the time. Devastating for my dad.
Right.
It was, he had dedicated his life. I mean, when Carol talks about him working with Dan as his, the boxer and the trainer, it was every night. He'd get home, he'd have dinner, and then the rest of the night was dedicated to, his boxer trainer, and get him to be able to walk and be able to function and to build whatever strength he was capable of developing.
Well, it must have been quite amazing when they said that he wasn't going to be able to walk, and your father proved them wrong in that regard. So there were no other services available. Ginny, your dad really seemed to be the main person in Danny's life and really helped him to walk. Were there no other supports or services available to the family at that point in time that you know of?
Not professionally, and it wasn't something. It was a different time, and it wasn't a good time in many ways because it was an embarrassment, it was a shame, you didn't really blend into the community, people didn't talk about it. It was a sad time that people should be. Now, my parents never felt that way, and everywhere we went, Dan was with us. But for many people, they didn't see that, they didn't recognize it, they didn't understand it. I think I had my first fight when I was 3 over neighborhood bullies picking on Dan. And that wasn't the last fight, because unfortunately that's the way it is. Bullies tend to be drawn toward the most vulnerable, and that's no different, it was no different then. I think there were a lot of difficulties. Dan had difficulties because he was incontinent, and my mother had all these children, and to have a child that was so demanding continuously, you couldn't leave him without supervision at any time. One time, he was left in his room, and he wanted to, she went to visit a neighbor, and he wanted to get out, so he pushed out the window and jumped out the second-story window into a rose bush. And these kinds of, he'd put his fist through a window. It was those kinds of behaviors that were so challenging that really made and took the ability to manage Dan beyond the capabilities and the resources that the family had.
Right. Tell us a little bit about your mom, because you talked about your dad coming home and really spending all the time and training and helping Dan walk, but Mom was home all day. So, Carol, can you talk a bit about your mother's role in
Yeah,
this?
she really took care of him, fed him, bathed him, kept him very nice and clean. And there was a school in Melville at the time. It was called Sample School, and that back then I think they just had like a play time, and she would take him there. She'd get him in a cab and take him down. Would have to pay for the cab, and so there were really no services that she could reach out. But she was good with them. He was really such a loving little boy. He was just a sweetheart.
Did your mom have to stay at the sample school with him, or was she able to
She
drop him
would stay
off?
with him.
She would stay with him.
Right.
So she really, all during the day and
Right.
24/7 was sort of the on person.
Right.
Yeah.
And then there were 4 of us at home then, my 2 older sisters, and then myself and Danny. So my sisters helped a lot also with my mom, And at one point my mother had a nervous breakdown, and I think it got harder for her after that, because she would be nervous, but she still tried, to do her best with Danny.
Right. Were there particular activities Danny liked to do that he liked when he was young?
He loved horses, so he would play with horses. He loved ripping up the newspaper all over the living room, and he just kind of liked to sit and watch us and laugh at the things we would do to make him laugh.
They used to have these blow-up things that were probably about 4 feet high that you bopped them.
Oh, yes.
He loved those. And he loved Etch-a-Sketches
Right.
and Slinkies. Those were his
And trains at Christmas.
trains. He loved Christmas. He loved Santa.
Right.
And he didn't have very many words, but ho 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 was one of his big ones.
Now, Ginny, you were saying, how many words did he have? How did he communicate?
He had probably about, I'm not a professional at it, but I would guess he had 200 words. Dad, car, tree, and then you got to hear that repertoire over and over and over. So it was dad, car, tree, ratty, but it just cycled through those. But he did have a way of telling you what he wanted. He would grab you and wanted something to drink. So today they would train children in sign language. Dan had developed his own. As the family growing up with him, you learned what he needed and when.
Right.
Now, of the siblings and of your parents, who was Dan particularly close to, or did he sort of treat everyone the same way?
Well, I think early he was closest to you because you were closest in age.
Right.
And then I think after you went into high school, he was maybe closer to me.
Right.
He really, the jealousy was strongest between my youngest sister and him. So we always had to look out for that. Like they'd be sitting calmly having dinner, all of a sudden Dan would pick up a fork and throw it at my sister. Just like, uh-oh, he's done with you.
You explained that Dan, when he was around 16, started to get some behaviors that were a bit aggressive and a little bit hard on your mom and the family. So talk a bit about the decision of getting him to Polk, because you mentioned that was a really difficult decision to make. So talk a bit about that, if you would.
Well, my mother had the nervous breakdown, and I think that was probably the initial beginning of that. And she was having a lot of problems with her nerves, after she came, because she was hospitalized. And it was just that all they kept doing to her is putting her back to sleep. She was exhausted. And this was after Danny was a little older and Virginia and Kathy just came along. Mm-hmm. Because they were, 2 years apart?
3.
They were 3 years apart. So my parents had their kids in twos, So we'd have 2, then 7 to 10 years later, there'd be 2 more. But I think that was the beginning. So she was under doctor's care for that. And I think that they just started to talk about it more and more, that it wasn't really good to have him home because someone could get hurt.
Right.
So
it almost sounds like it was 2 separate families. The older kids with Dan, it's part of that group, and then a younger group.
Correct.
It was the younger kids that he was challenging a little bit.
Right. And I think, just like a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old, he liked my dad. That was his buddy. And anyone that would go near my father, or if you did something different to him, like if my sons, if they laid on the couch and fell asleep, that would bother him. So then he'd go over and grab them. And, so there were some things that he just didn't like. So you had to really be careful what you did in front of him, to keep him happy. But that began it. And then the doctor suggested that they maybe put him in Polk. And
So that was my mother's doctor.
Right.
Had suggested that it was too much for her.
How did your dad respond to that?
He denied it for a long time. He had a brother who was a police officer, who was sort of like the Uncle Tom was the mentor in his family, and it was my uncle who came and had the conversation with him, and basically said, "What are you going to do if he kills one of these little girls?"
Right.
Yeah, it had to be a very difficult decision to make, and both for you as children to watch that as well. Can you talk a bit about the actual move to Polk, the first day that Dan went? How did that unfold? Did you get to go? Did just your mom and dad go?
We all went in the car and took him up, and they took him in, and we didn't stay very long because we couldn't stand it. So we left and came home, and my dad was just devastated. That's not what he wanted. And I remember him taking a walk. He left the house, and we didn't see him all night. So he walked all night. And that was the first time I ever saw my dad really cry. That he was so sad that Danny was in this school. And he didn't like it for a long time. And a lot of times we'd go up to get Danny to bring him home, and my dad would just take him and get him right out to the car, Where as I got older, I would go up and sit in their living room with them. But my dad, he didn't want any parts of that. He wanted him home. And
so how did Danny adjust? I mean, this had to be a big move for him as well. So at 16, he's now at Polk. He's away from the family. Can you talk a bit about his adjustment to being at Polk?
Well, it was funny because when he first went up, he never wanted to be there. He always wanted, and we brought him home so much. We brought him home for the holidays. My dad in the summer would almost bring him home the whole summer. So he was used to being home. And so as soon as we would get there, or if they told him that we were coming, he would sit by the window at Polk and just watch for us. But it was funny, when you took him back, he had this personality that was so great, because halfway up he would still be saying, "Mommy, home, home, home." But then as we got closer and closer to Polk, it was almost like he accepted it. So then we'd get to Polk, I'd pull the car in, and he'd get out and he'd kind of walk in front of me.
He'd sort of dismiss you and say,
Yeah.
"Get out of here now."
Right. And then he'd go to the attendants, and he'd do the same thing, "Mommy," because I'd call everyone Mommy and Daddy. But so he accepted it, but he knew how to go back, And it really didn't take long for him to be like that, But as soon as he got in that car to come home, he'd be saying, "Mommy, home, home, home."
And did your mom and dad both go up to pick him up typically?
Yeah, we all did.
Oh, so as a family, you would go and go get him. And
actually, we had another family that were cousins, and their boy was Mongoloid, or Downs, and we would take them. We had a station wagon, and we would take his family and our family, and would all pile in a station wagon and would pack a basket and would get both of them and would take them up to Sandy Lake. There was a little park, and would almost do that every weekend. And that was our life. And we basically learned to love it because he was so important to us. And I always think I have a lot of patience, and I always think that's where I learned it, because I had to just sit back and wait.
Right.
And then when Danny would go to bed and he'd find me asleep, my dad would come and have tea with me, would have tea parties. And my sisters, they would be older and they would go out on their dates, so we always got our time. It was a loving, Irish family, so. And all my aunts and uncles would come over and help with Danny. And when my mother went to the hospital, my aunts would come over. So we were a close family. And I was probably at the point in my life when all the relatives were young and could get around. No one was really sick. And I think Virginia and Kathy didn't experience that so much, with the relatives coming and just sitting around the kitchen table with Danny.
Mm-hmm. Now, people probably don't realize, how far away was Polk? How long did it take to drive there?
Oh,
Probably 2.5 hours then. It's shorter. It's more like 2 hours now with 79
right.
open. But it was longer. And then if you had bad weather, which you often had, that's the snow belt that runs right across Polk. So you'd have some bad weather coming up. And Carol sort of glossed over what was it like when Dan was first there and how he adjusted. And I can't talk this because I'll say this because I'll cry. But it was horrible when you dropped him off and you would hear him screaming, "Daddy, Daddy." And at one time, he somehow got out the door and was running down the road.
It was my dad and I. And he was running down the road chasing the car. And we had to just keep going. And then finally he turned around and went back. But that was so devastating. We cried all the way home, So he really loved us and we loved him.
Were you able to keep in touch with Dan by phone, to call him on occasion, or was that not part of the...
No, that wasn't early on. You could do that today. You could do that probably 10 years ago, 15 years ago. But when he first went up, you couldn't do that. They didn't have that capability.
So you would just let the staff know that you were coming up, or you just...
You would have to tell them. They had an administration. You actually had to sign them out, and you had to tell them when you were leaving and when you were coming back.
Mm-hmm. Now, was it unusual for someone to come home as often as Dan and to stay home for the summertime?
Yes. I mean, a lot of the people up there never got home. And when...
I didn't realize how rare it was. There was no basis for us to understand that it was not normal until this was when I first called about. One time this was actually about 27 years ago, we were bringing home Dan for Polk, and I called and I said, well, maybe there's some guys who don't come. Why don't I stop and we'll get them some presents? So I called up and I said, in Dan's unit, there was 100 people. I said, there must be a few who don't come home. Let me know who they are and I'd like to buy them something. And that was when she told me, your brother's the only one that comes home. Mm-hmm. And I was just shocked. It never occurred to me. I never knew that.
So when you first went up to Polk, what was your impressions of Polk itself? The area, the buildings,
Oh, it was like a college campus. That's what it always reminded me of. Green, farmland, and it was beautiful. And a lot of them were babies at that time, so they had these cribs that had the sides would be up, and because they had to be careful that they would get out of their crib and hurt themselves. And at that time, when Danny first went up, there were 3,000 patients. And
it was a fully functioning farm. It was a fully functioning community. It had its own power. It had its own water supply. It had a lake. It had a dairy farm. It had a farm where they grew their own vegetables. They made their own bread. It really was an amazing community. And it's in the middle of nowhere, which was also, I think, to have such a large population of children because they were of all ages back then. They were completely safe because you weren't in the middle of a neighborhood where people were going to drive through and pick up a few kids. It was just really a self-contained area that was very, like I said, it was beautiful. And I think that's one thing. As hard as it was to leave Dan there, he was in a beautiful place. It was gorgeous. The air was clean. It's just everything was gorgeous about it.
Well, you've said that you appreciated Polk for its care of your brother. What stands out in particular? What sort of things did the staff do that made you so appreciative of the staff?
Well, for me, it was they just really loved him. Danny was real easy to love. He was gentle and he would hug them, and people were up there as many years as he was, and they had him in different cottages on any given time. So most of them really got to know him, and if I'd go up years later, they'd say, "Oh, I remember Danny when he was younger, and he was walking around." And the other thing is they got him involved. Danny loved horses, and they would get him involved in these activities that he would go on a horse. They'd put him on this horse with his gear on, and they would take him to a track. So anything that they saw that he liked in his room, they made it like, it was all horses. Everything was horses. And everyone, no matter what cottage they worked in, they knew him. It was just like, because he was so sweet. Because a lot of them, they would just sit and they wouldn't say too much, but Danny would never stop talking, even though he couldn't talk.
He would call you darling.
Yeah.
Mommy, daddy.
And
He'd kiss your hand.
Right, and he'd love the girls, that were taking care of him.
But I think that's really important, is that from the early time at Polk to even today, there was a strong evolution of the population declined, the services that were available and the way they were managed changed. And they all changed in a reflection of the way they were changing in society. Mm-hmm. IEPs were being developed for people. They had a new understanding of what kinds of therapeutic training and educational systems, and Polk adopted those, and those began to be implemented there as well. So we saw that change.
What's some of the activities that he was involved in during the course of the day and during the course of the week? What sort of things did he do on the campus there at Polk?
Well, everything. Dan had a job. He worked at the gardening center, and he also would help mix cement. They made little lawn ornaments. And he went to church a couple times a week. He knew the priests, and he knew all of the people there. They had dances. Dan wasn't much of a dancer, but he sure enjoyed being around with everyone and the music. And they had lots of themes. They actually would come down and go to ball games. They went to the theater. They had people come in and put on shows. So they were very active in trying to keep everybody entertained and amused. And I contrast, one of the things that is particularly interesting about Polk is that the people who work at Polk, the caregivers, they had a better salary working in the state institutions than you might find at group homes here. They also had a far longer tenure, so that the average person was far more skilled and may have been at Polk for 20 years. Mm-hmm. So they knew their jobs, they were dedicated, they valued things. And sometimes you see a very high level of turnaround where people don't really know anything about any of the residents at all. But at Polk, that's different. I mean, they go and John likes it if you throw him a ball. Someone else likes it if they like to wear stuffed animals. And all the staff really understands what it is about each specific resident and what they like and how they can best improve their quality of life. Right.
Now, you said Polk was located in a pretty isolated area. So where did the staff reside? Where did they live?
In that area, the Franklin, Venango.
Oil City.
Oil City, so they
Okay.
come from
So
those.
people came from very close by then.
Yeah. I would guess, and I think it's true, I knew it at one time, Polk is the #1 employer for that region.
That region, okay. Now, I had heard that Danny liked fishing as well.
I like being outdoors, and in one of the things they have, a little trail behind Polk, they have a little camping area where they would go out and they would have picnics during the day and go on fishing retreats, and so it was fun. And it's, like I said, it's such a beautiful place. It's in a valley where you look and you're surrounded by green mountains, and if you're familiar with Pennsylvania, some of the mountains of Pennsylvania are the most beautiful that. I'm not going to argue with Colorado, but we've got some pretty things here.
Good. And were there community outings as well, where he did things outside of Polk?
Yes.
You mentioned a ball game. What sort of other community outings might occur?
They went on the Gateway Clipper. They had boats. They went to
Vacation.
They went out
Vacations?
with us.
Oh.
Yeah, I'm talking. You're talking about the Polk outings.
Polk, yeah.
Yeah, but they went to the beach, remember? They took Danny on a vacation to the beach.
Oh, did they? I didn't know this.
They took a busload.
Oh,
And they would take them to Myrtle Beach and almost anything. Probably things that I haven't done, he's gotten to do.
So it sounds like he had a very active life on campus there, as well as getting off of campus, and that also includes coming home to be with you and your family
Right.
for holidays and other times.
and one of the things they do at Polk is they have a sort of a cottage center organization, so that there's a central area that may have anywhere between 10 and 15 residents in that area, with a living room and a TV and a little kitchen area, and then spinning off of that are their bedrooms, so that you have a lot of interaction with other residents and they know each other, and it really, I think that's another benefit of being in Polk, is that he's not isolated. He has his own community of people right there.
Right. Now, did he have classes or school at Polk as well?
They had training programs, they had swimming programs, they had physical therapy. And again, that evolved. Early on, when they had 3,000 people, they didn't have as much of that. But like I said, the offerings and the support systems evolved as they did generally, and of what's available in society.
Now, one of the things I heard about was the Circus Day in the 1960s at Polk. Can you talk a bit about Circus Day and what that meant to Dan?
Every fall, they would have this day that they would build floats, they would have a parade, they would have bagpipers, bands from the local area, and it would be an all-day affair. And we would go up and spend the day, and I'll just interject that Danny kept grabbing my dad and saying home.
But it was like a huge celebration for
Right.
all the families and all the residents at Polk. So it was like started in the morning, and it was a day of rides, and they had amusement parks, sort of like a county fair kind of setting, and they had competitions and an art show, and it was really very much like a small Butler County Fair kind
Right.
of a gig. And then in the they sold food, and they had picnics, and you could bring your own picnic. And then in the evening, they had a brilliant fireworks display that was put on by Zimbali, or the local fireworks, and they had these ships that would be in battle with each other with their fireworks and knock each other down. And it was a great day. I remember everybody looked forward to it. It was a fun thing that they did. And each cottage built their own float, and they had bands. It was just really a fun day.
Danny went to Polk at the age of 16, and he was having some behavioral issues at that point in time. Being at Polk, how did he change, or did he change, and how did he behave over the years while he was there?
Well, I do believe that the behavioral interventions that were developed and some of the therapeutic things they worked on him with did help. But I also think that the issues that triggered him, and he mellowed. the hormonal issues perhaps and the frustrations. He learned to better deal with those, and he wasn't as jealous with my father. So a lot of the tensions and triggers went away. But even up to the end of his life, you'd still have times when he would fly off and grab somebody unpredictably. You would never know when. And his favorite thing to do was actually grab you by your hair and pull a little 3-year-old by their hair. It's not you don't want to happen, we don't want to have, that's not going to work in the public. And I think that was one of the things. Dan could not really be easily introduced to the public because of that unpredictability. And I don't think that unpredictability is an uncommon feature in many people with mental disabilities, and it's a challenge.
Right. And when you did come home with the family, how did he behave well when he came home on those short visits or during the summertime?
Oh, yeah.
And how did your mom do when he came home?
Dan kept you tethered home. So it's like, I think she had a great deal of freedom because the kids were growing. When Dan came home, it was as though you had a toddler back in the house again. Mm-hmm. And so it was all of a sudden he was 24/7 demands on people's times again. Mm-hmm. And so there was that strain and that challenge, especially when my father wasn't there. And you could do more and more things with Dan, but you couldn't take him to a movie. He wouldn't reliably sit through a movie. He would become agitated and just couldn't conform to other environments very well.
Okay. And we lived in a community where the people were close, and he would go outside and talk to all the neighbors and, go to the fence. And I always noticed when I would bring him home after my parents were gone, that I would, all the way home, he'd be saying, "Mommy, home, home, home." And when we'd pull up, he'd get out of the car and he'd kind of change his swagger and bebop up to my house because I lived right next door to where we grew up.
Okay.
So he knew that place. Mm-hmm. And he would look out the window, and if he saw the new neighbor who lived in our house then, he'd be standing in the window saying, "No, go away. That's not your house." But he liked to come home, didn't he?
And he did. I remember one time there was a neighbor who had a motorcycle, and Dan loved a motorcycle. And the neighbor was really good to Dan. And one day the neighbor was missing his helmet. It turned out Dan had stolen it.
And when he could eat, he loved to come home and eat because, their food's not that great. But he would come home and we'd buy him Diet Pepsi. We spoiled him when he would come home.
He was a diabetic, you felt.
I know.
Yeah, Dan developed diabetes.
It was from all those trips home. Because we just spoiled him, and he'd go in the kitchen, and he even though he couldn't talk, he could communicate, and he knew what was going on. So I'd be in the living room, and I'd give him a glass of pop, and then he'd go in the kitchen, and I would be sitting in the living room, and I could hear him. He's opening the pop, and he'd pour it in his glass, and if you got up and went into the kitchen, he'd just like a typical kid. I wasn't doing anything. And then he'd watch the football games and yell and scream just like he knew everything was going on. So he was a fun guy, and everybody loved him. He was just really friendly.
Oh, good.
And the only ones he beat up on was us, or you, Kathy.
Well, in the 1970s, some things were happening at Polk, and there was a newspaper expose at that point in time talking about overcrowding and the use of cages for people who were living there. Did you see any of this, or did you have any indications that this was going on? Because you visited quite often at Polk. What were your impressions?
Polk was crowded. There were a lot of people there. It was it was the only resource in the area that was helping people through crisis at that point in time. So the crowding was real. But there was never any abuse that was associated with that. There was never any inappropriate restraints. We never saw anything of that. One of my feelings is a concern is that for the management of Polk, more and more was asked of them, and budgets were never increased to be able to support the additional. If you had 3,000 people into a facility, you need to increase the budget so that you can provide. And instead, what happened is you increase you increase the population without increase the resources, and then penalize the administrators who were being victimized by that same system. And that's what I feel happened to, I think, Dr. McClelland at the time. Because McClelland, my family personally knew him. He took the time to interact with each of the many, many, many residents there. He at the time, back then too, all of the staff wore uniforms. They were disciplined, they were professional, they were caring. It was very appropriate. I never saw Danny abused.
Right. And as far as the cages, I think I mentioned before that they did have, they had long porches before you went into a cottage, and they'd have the beds like cribs, but they came up high, and maybe in some cases there was a top, but they were open, and they weren't tied down. They were just in there and safe. And so if that's where they got the definition of cages, I never saw anything like that or any abuse.
I saw what I think was described by the media and people who were attacking the system as cages, and it was the same thing. It was like they were tall-sided cribs.
Right.
I've seen those same things at Children's Hospital. That's exactly the same kind of a system they use for kids who are in care there. It wasn't but again, I think we've all learned too well. The way it's reported becomes the reality in some ways. And you can report it in a way that treats it realistically, or you can attack it. And I think that was really it was an era of attack.
Yeah. Now, you as a family, you even indicated it was somewhat unusual that you visited Dan so often and took him home so often, where the other families didn't necessarily do that. I think, Carrie, you might have said they walked away. I mean, you placed your child there, and as difficult it was, you walked away. Do you ever get any indications from other families about how care for their children went, or did you have contact with other families?
Not well. There's a family groups up at Polk, and I've never heard any of the families report that kind of abuse. They
were all happy. A lot of them were old. A lot of the patients were old because, back in the day when it was frowned on, and they would bring them, and there would be a train real close, and they would just come on a train and drop them off. So, and they left, and they never came back. So these people had a pretty lonely life until the Flavin girls started doing Christmas for them. Because some of the people, they would just sit there when we first started going up, and then when they realized it was for everyone, that they were included. So it's really just amazing the way human nature is, that even though they have deformities, they have mental issues, they still are people, and they had feelings, and you could tell at a time like that. And they used to have, I guess they got clothes. I don't know how they got their clothes, but they weren't the greatest things. But when they started doing Christmas, they'd come up with all the fashions and who's some of them?
Ralph Lauren was a big
Ralph
season
Lauren.
one season.
And so I remember one time viewing the way they would walk down the hall when they had their old other stuff on. And then when we started going to these Christmas things, and they had all the fashion designer things, designer jeans, and they would be bebopping down the hall. It was like that fit them. So they wanted the same things we all do.
Families would drop their kids off during the Depression at Polk for a while, and they'd come back and pick them up again when they can afford them. They had schools. They had K through 12, like right there. And it wasn't for mentally handicapped children. They were for normally functioning families that couldn't care for their children.
Jeannie, can you talk a bit more about the overcrowding and equally what was happening to other institutions in the state at that point in time? Western, down in Canonsburg. What were your impressions of that, and why were these things occurring?
I think that represented a point in time when society itself was trying to take a different position and be more opening and more accommodating and more accepting of a handicapped and those with mental challenges within the community. And over the time, though, the populations within Polk, because it was the only resource that people had to support families, had really grown to that. So the facility was supporting over 3,000 residents. And you keep putting more and more people into a residence, they didn't have the flexibility of providing them all the resources that you'd want. So instead of what ultimately they had was a living room setting, back in the days when there were 3,000 residents, it was more dormitory, where beds were lined up, and it had to be more regimen. Everybody had very little flexibility when you're managing that many people. And so appropriately, I think people started to say, an institution isn't the right solution for everyone, and we do really need to investigate, do some of those people belong in the community and integrated into the community? And I think Olmsted started a process of reviewing what were the appropriate placements for people. And many people were taken out of Polk and put into group homes at that point. That eased a lot of the overcrowding that happened in the institution. And I think that one thing that's really important to keep in mind is the people who were taken from the institutions early were very high functioning and very able and easily able to fit within the community. And so as they pulled the healthier and the higher functioning people out, the level of people within the community were more severe and required a higher level of supports, a higher level of medical care. And that, as they continued to transition people into the group home, that happened more and more. So that by the time you got to the 80s, probably, mid-80s, late 90s.
Well, 1999 is when the U.S. Supreme Court issued the Olmsted decision that you just mentioned, which ruled that unjustified segregation in state institutions and nursing homes were a violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which had come out in 1990. So Pennsylvania, like you said, started to move people out of Polk and other institutions. You had a different thought on this whole process. So can you talk a bit about what occurred then and what your family did and what you did as sisters of Danny to make sure he was going to be okay?
Yes. One of the things, as I said, people began to be removed from the institution and into communities, which were very appropriate settings. People could easily function in the local restaurants, and they could get to work. They could have jobs. There were a lot of people who really fit. It was an appropriate transition. But as the transition took over, they started moving people out of the institutions who weren't appropriate placements in a community. People who had, my brother, if you put him on a bus with another child, he could easily grab that child and do harm. So you'd never want someone like my brother into the community. Also, not only the potential for harm, I think, is low. I think what's higher potential is for them to become victimized by the community. They're very vulnerable and subject to theft, subject to crime. And what we saw is that the good idea of transitioning out of institutions became a train wreck, where the distinction between what was an appropriate placement and wasn't got lost. And I believe personally that it was driven by financial motivations. People wanted to get rid of that line item in the state budget. And an example of one that closed before it was Western Center. And I was contacted by some of the advocacy people at Western because they knew that I was opposing broadly rules for mainstreaming everyone. And I was contacted by some of the people. And so I went over to Western And I walked in, and I drove into the neighborhood of Western Center, and I could see there was a development of $1 million homes called South Point that had encroached around. The only thing in the middle of this development was Western Center. And it was apparent within 5 minutes that this was not about what was best for the residents of Western Center. This was about some developers needing the land. And they closed that property. They took people out of that before they had placement. They put some of the people from residents into a hotel. One of the residents went into a group home that did not have appropriate training for the residents that were placed in there. This resident had a history of seizures, but they decided that he liked to be alone in the bathroom by himself when he took a bath. So they actually administered the seizure medication while he was sitting in the bathtub. 2 hours later, he was dead. And that's an example, not an isolated instance. The level of death for the first 5 years after being released tripled what it was for people who remained in institutions. And again, for the first series of people where they were in appropriate community placement, you didn't have those negative outcomes. But you needed to have someone looking at them with a serious eye to say who belongs in the community and when is that placement not appropriate.
Now, so you went, actually had a lawsuit around this, didn't you?
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk a bit about the lawsuit and what the results of that was?
What was happening at Polk is people from the state, I don't know, state were going into the institution and determining that they would take the resident and move them out without contacting family, without contacting anyone, no discussion of it. They were just randomly moving people around the state. And we were contacted because there were a group of sisters who were in their 70s, and their relative, who had been in Polk all of her life, they lived here. They were going to move her to Ebensburg, which was a hardship because in their 70s they couldn't travel there. They visited her frequently, and they had no ability to. Basically, they were told she's gone. They weren't told in advance. It was just atrocious. So my husband, who's a lawyer, Mick Probanik, worked with them and filed a pro bono lawsuit saying that the family had to have input into the decisions to move patients out of institutions. And at that time, that wasn't what was practiced. But he contested that, and locally within Venango County, he won the case that in the future, parents had to be a part of caregivers and guardians had to be part of the decision to move people. And that's just appropriate. That's just appropriate. And fortunately for us, the state, the various state legal systems decided to contest the decision. And every time you contested the decision, you made it more broadly acceptable. And so it ultimately became state law. So we're really proud of that.
Now, your family didn't want Dan to move into a group home. The reasons, again, were why?
Safety. And at Polk, Dan has 24/7 medical care. And exploring the level of quality at group homes, what we found is there's no oversight. There's not standards. We were told by one group, and this was someone who worked within the group homes, and the agency had maybe 20 different group homes. And we talked to someone who worked within the group and who had left and said, why? And they said, we have two kinds of group homes. The ones that we put the level of standards that we have for people who have family, and the group homes that we put people in who don't have family. And the implications were clear. And there's no oversight, there's no management, there's no assurances that doesn't happen. Mm-hmm. And I think these people, they're being victimized, they're being lost. If you were to, one study, they took a list of the people who were released from institutions, and they couldn't find about a third of them. How many of those became homeless? How many of those ended up in the river? How many of those ended up being victims of crime? How many of those are in prison? It's estimated that 1/3 of our prison population are people who were released from mental institutions or institutions for the mentally retarded. That's my opposition to that.
Well, thank you. Sadly, Danny died this year at the age of 72 after many years of living at Polk. And a memorial service was held at Polk, and I think you indicated 60 to 90 people attended, and many of those folks were the staff at Polk who knew Dan. And at the memorial service for your brother, you said your sister Kathy read a thank you letter to the Polk Center staff. And Carol, I was wondering if you wouldn't mind reading a section of that letter.
Sure. Okay, over the years, Polk Center has evolved in many ways, but the one thing that has always been steadfast is the incredible staff of loving caregivers. For them, residents are family, so many of the residents call the staff Mommy and Daddy. The staff does so much to make Polk comfortable and homey. They work hard to make all living areas comfortable and inviting. Each bedroom shows loving touches that reflect each resident's loves, interests, and passions. Danny Boy's room would have made any cowboy proud. Horses everywhere, family pictures, favorite Western movies, and more horses. They work so hard to make life at Polk special and fun, filled with all the joys of community. We loved Danny Boy's pictures from the theme dances. He loved picnics and outings, especially the horseback riding outings, and he always participated in Catholic Mass. Everything in Danny Boy's life at Polk was designed for his fulfillment, safety, and health. His diet was carefully prescribed. The medical care he received from Polk doctors and nurses was surpassed. Dr. McCarr knew Danny Boy well. He truly cared for him. He loved him. All of those who cared for Danny Boy did. We've loved to mention each of you personally in this letter, but it would become too lengthy. But you know who we're talking about. All the truly special people who care deeply, who go the extra mile, who protect and love Polk residents each day. Polk is the only place I know where people who are continually bedridden suffer no bed sores. U.S. hospitals consider it inevitable, but at Polk it doesn't happen. We credit this type of loving care with Danny Boy living to 72, well beyond the normal life expectancy of someone with this type of handicaps.
Thank you, Carol.
You're welcome.
No, neither one of you like to shout out your own good works, but you started a tradition at Polk around Christmas. Can you just share a little bit of that?
As I was mentioning, I called one day to see if there were a couple people who didn't get to go from home, and I was going to buy a couple of gifts. And what I discovered is that in Danny's building of 100, he was the only one who went home. So we figured we had to do something about that. And so the first year, we collected gifts for that building of 100. But the entire institution at the time had about 900 people in it. And we couldn't finish until we covered everybody. And so that was 27 years ago. So ever since then, we have been collecting, gathering, wrapping, and delivering Christmas presents the Saturday before Christmas to everybody in the building. And while the gifts that we bring are great, what we really consider is the gift of our time to be able to spend with each and every one and just laugh and practice ho, ho, ho.
Something Danny liked to say.
Quoting Dan every time we do that.
We know that as Western closed, there's certainly potential for Polk to close as well. And so what are your thoughts about that happening?
My feeling is that we need places like that, and I'm sure there are many people out in the world that they're not being moved anywhere and they're just sitting who knows where. They could be in the street. They could be right in your own neighborhood and you don't even know that they exist. So we do need it. The group homes are good for certain people, but not for all. Mm-hmm. And if you ever went on a tour of Polk, you'd see what we mean.
Ginny,
right?
what are your thoughts, Ginny?
I think there's only 200 people being maintained by a facility that, employs hundreds of people now, so the economics don't make sense anymore. And I hope that it will close. It may close as soon as this year or next year. I just think it's inevitable. But I think, and my wish is that for those people who are looking at the future of how we're going to care for people, that they do it thoughtfully. They do it by really closely looking at how do you segregate the kinds of populations that's there. I don't mean segregate, I mean profile. This are the kinds of needs of group A versus group B, and create solutions that match people's needs so that we're not putting people in situations that are inappropriate to their capabilities and able to really fulfill their needs. For many people, this group doesn't have a voice, and so they're easy to abuse unless we have a voice for them and make sure that we look out and they do have solutions that give them and optimize their quality of life. And while I think we have to say goodbye to Polk, I hope we can say hello to better solutions.
Okay. Well, thank you. Now, I understand you have a niece who has two sons in their 20s who have the same genetic disorder that Danny had. And can you speak a bit about their lives and how their lives are different than Danny's at this point in time, or are they different than Danny's?
I think from the very day they were born, their lives were different than Dan's because the level of support is greater. They had continuous support. They had medical support. We understand medically how to optimize behaviors, how to optimize health. My niece Nancy's children are much more higher functioning than Dan was able to achieve. They are very active in this society. They very recently, they're 20 and 23, I believe. They just recently moved into a group home. But the whole time they were at home, my niece had continuous support. And that's what's different today. They really are providing the support to the families and to those suffering with disabilities. And it made for a much higher quality of life for everyone.
Carol, anything else you'd like to say about the differences you see in your niece's children and what's happening with them?
Oh, right. They're getting much more than we received or that was available to us. The school that my mother took Danny to, that's no longer there, and so there's not really. I'm sure there's a lot of disabled people that are getting the care, but I don't know about the Polk people. They're just gone. We don't know where either. So hopefully something will happen.
Okay. I want to thank you both for sharing some of the hard things and some of the wonderful things and the ho-ho-hos and the cowboys. And so thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you. I appreciated being here.
This interview was recorded on December 14, 2018 at Studio Me, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Interviewer was Guy Caruso. Videographers were Ryan Haggerty and Matthew Thornton. This is an interview with Virginia Flavin Perbanik and Carol Flavin Purshouse. They are the sisters of Danny Flavin, who lived for 56 years at Polk State Center, an institution in Venango County. The Western Pennsylvania Disability History and Action Consortium expresses sincere appreciation to Virginia Flavin Perbanik, Carol Flavin Purshouse, Senator John Hines History Center, Edith L. Trees Charitable Trust, FISA Foundation, Achieva, Institute on Disabilities at Temple University. Photos of Danny Flavin, courtesy Virginia Flavin Perbanik and Carol Flavin Purshouse. A map of Polk Center is from Polk Center, 90 Years, a pictorial history of Polk Center in Polk, Pennsylvania. Carol Lee K. Mishner and Dennis L. Armstrong, Venango County Historical Society, Franklin, PA, 1987. This interview is a production of the Western Pennsylvania Disability History and Action Consortium. The logo of the Western Pennsylvania Disability History and Action Consortium shows the map of Pennsylvania. The counties in the western half of the state are highlighted. To learn more about disability history in Western Pennsylvania, visit www.wpih.org. wpdhac.org. Copyright Western Pennsylvania Disability History and Action Consortium, 2020, all rights reserved.